Hello, everyone, and welcome to Getting the Most of CATIA V5 FT&A Captures in a Digital World with Trisha Freeman. Trisha, welcome. I will pass things to you.
My background is in aerospace engineering. I am a space nerd through and through, and I worked, my first job I worked as a civil servant for the U.S. Navy on different communication platforms, and I got to do some cool stuff with just supporting some new satellite systems. And then while I was there, and also a little bit in college, I got to, do a lot of CAD modeling, and that was what I found I most liked to do. So I switched careers here, and I've been with RAND 3D for the past 7 years as one of their technical training engineers. And for me specifically, I tend to stay on the CATIA version 5 side of things. So that's just a little bit about myself, and we'll jump in here to the actual content of the webinar, which is going over, getting the most out of those CATIA FT&A captures in a digital world. So traditionally, when we were to make a 3D model, whether it be a part file or a product file in whatever CAD system that you had, you would make the actual object, so the individual chunk of mass, so you would make that shape. But then you would have a separate 2D drawing file that was associated with that. And it was in that drawing file where you would place all of those specialty notes, those dimensions, geometric tolerances, all of those annotations. So that's kind of the traditional method where we would open up and look at the 3D data, and then if we wanted to know specifics and then also all that information and have it to be, physically manufactured and produced, we would find that in the 2D data. And I am very much one of the people who think that is not going to be the case in the future. I'm not saying I know how much time it's going to take for us to get there, but there are companies who are switching over to this method of not having the 2 separate independent files and just kind of having everything in one. So that concept of having everything in one in CATIA version 5 is what we call our FT&A workbenches, our functional tolerancing and annotation, and there's one for part files and then one for products, but they're pretty much the same and all the icons are the same. So inside of our model, as you can see here on this slide, it does look a little chaotic because everything's visualized, but inside of the model you can see that I have what would eventually look like the 2D views from the drawing file, but it's now imposed inside of the 3D file itself. So this allows one file to be a single source of data rather than having the 2 different files. And really it's about simplification, being able to find all the data inside of one location and eliminating any discrepancies between the 2. So we have this capability inside of CATIA's 3D FT&A workbenches, but the problem is that when you open up a file, and it looks something like what you would see on this slide here, just a bunch of kind of chaos all around, how do we have CATIA to help us out by, like in the case of maybe like a detailed view, going into a certain spot with a camera, or maybe if it's a section cut view, how do we tell CATIA to both zoom into that particular area plus section cut it? So this is where we're going to tie in having the pre-existing FT&A data, but incorporating our captures. So 3D captures are a method of combining that 2D data in with our 3D model while being able to control other kind of custom aspects, camera viewpoint, whether or not you want things hatched or visible. So that's what we're going to be going over here inside of our webinar. And I have just a couple of screen captures to kind of show you from the clutter. Right, I can use those captures to quickly show me like a detailed view of a certain area, or down at the bottom I have a cross-section cut. So we're going to be going over how to establish camera viewpoints today for our captures. That's typically always the first thing that you do whenever you know that you're setting up a capture, is you define that camera viewpoint for that particular area. And we're going to do that with a button in our quick views file called the named views. We're going to talk about the importance of utilizing these annotation filters so that way when we do go into a particular capture, we're not seeing a bunch of remnants of things that we don't need for that particular view. If it does happen to be cutting through the innards of your part or product file. We'll discuss the options for the clipping views and how to have that to be automatically activated when you go into that capture. And then also managing the part's visibility status. So if there's multi-bodies within a single part file and you would want for certain captures some of those bodies or geometrical sets to be hidden or shown, or the other application is if you're doing a product file and you want certain parts within the product file to then be hidden or shown. We'll talk about that. And there's a couple of internal settings. I'll show you them here in a second that kind of go along with that. So as long as you know where these internal settings are, it's pretty good. And then really quickly, I'm going to show you one of the newer buttons that they've added. I believe it was in release for 25 for CATIA, is a button called Principal Views. And that Principal View is going to create a couple of both views and captures kind of quickly for you. All of the information that I'm going to be going over is taught in our actual 3D FT&A class. So I am going to teach the class assuming that you guys already know how to set up views and like what's required to set up the views, and then I'm not going to go into any details to how to add like the dimensions or any of those specialty symbols. So again, that type of stuff, if you want to know more about that, you can take our 3D FT&A class. So we're going to be focusing on just the actual like captures portion of this here for CATIA. So give me just a second. I'm going to switch over and share my CATIA screen, and then we'll jump into, if it'll come up eventually, then we'll go over to the content here. Okay, and Kareem, if for some reason you can't see my CATIA screen, sorry guys, they just updated our web. Okay, so first let's just kind of go over, I already have a pre-populated part file here with a bunch of captures, and let's just kind of talk about, why we're doing this, why it's a good thing to use these captures. So again, a way of the future, I think, is that we're not going to be dependent on the physical 2D separate drawing files. We're going to have all of this information embedded into our 3D part file. And I have my annotation set here for this part file, and you can tell that there's nothing underneath that, right? No branches expanded. And that's because one of the things, you can do is you can have that annotation data to just be hidden. So I'm going to right-click on that annotation set and turn that to be on. So now this is where you're going to start to see the clutter. All right, all of this, what would it be, individual views within a drawing is now here on my screen. So by creating these different captures, and I have a handful of them here, it's allowing you to go into what would have been those individual views. So the first one that I have here, I'm labeling this one the ISO view. I've also seen this referred to as a default view, or sometimes I've seen a front quarter view. But basically the ISO view, and we'll talk about this when we do this ourselves in this next little section, is a way of just saying, hey, I want to go back to seeing every single thing on the screen, all annotations. Now, if I wanted to focus on a particular view, so maybe I want to say, well, let's just show me the front view information. I can right-click on that and hit Display Capture, and you can see that the camera swings around to a camera viewpoint that I get to control. And then once it swings around, it also only shows certain dimensions or certain annotations. And these are the things that we're going to set up here in a second, telling CATIA to only show me, in this case, the 4 dimensions that I have here on the screen. And you may see a bunch of these like little blue dashed boxes. That's just showing you those actual view frames. And you can right click and hit hide show if you want to like completely declutter your screen if you want. I think that's a lot of times it's personal preference if it bugs you, but again, you can hide it if you want. I like to leave them on the screen so I can see them. If we right click on a rear view and hit display capture, again, it swings around to a different camera viewpoint that I get to control, and it shows, in this case, I've got a couple of dimensions and then a geometric tolerance here. Side detail view. So if I right-click and hit Display Capture here, notice that this would almost be, you know, like a more controlled, more zoomed-in camera viewpoint with some more dimensions. And then now we're getting into our section cut. So as soon as I right-click on that, you may have seen how it like cuts it. And so obviously the section view is cutting it at a diagonal. So once I actually right-click and hit Display the actual capture, this is when my camera location that I created and saved is applied, but because this knows that it's some type of section cut, it'll physically section cut, as you can see, my model. Excuse me. It has the actual area of cross-section highlighted in this green shade, and then I have some hatching lines as well. If I go to the top view, right-click and hit Display Capture, same thing. I have a camera viewpoint. I have a section cut. If I go to the notes, right-click and hit Display. In this case, I have a camera viewpoint associated it. And then if I display on my surface finish, this time I have kind of all three things happening. I have a saved camera viewpoint, I have a section cut happening, and then I also have a couple of surfaces here that are highlighted just to kind of clarify that, you know, these items, if they're highlighted in yellow, they have the same surface roughness. So the right-clicking and hitting Display Capture is how you would physically tell CATIA to kind of go through all of this. So let's step through and talk about, because I have a lot of my students in class say, well, why do I even need to create a capture? Because technically, if you go and create a view, you can right-click and display the view, and it's going to work almost the same. But when you right-click on Display a View, you don't get to control the camera, and sometimes you get to control the clipping, whether or not it's kind of cutting through it, but a lot of times you actually have to manually do that with the little clipping buttons beside. So let's just do a quick comparison. So I have this view, which is my surface finish view. So if I right-click on this and hit Display, it did move the camera, but it moved the camera, as you can see, in such a way that, like, I only see the annotations. So when you right-click and display on the view, the camera will always only try and get the annotation data. And in this case, I can't see the actual, like, part file and then those highlighted surfaces. So I would have to do a little bit of manual adjustment in order to be able to see that, right? So I have to kind of manually adjust it. Also, this is supposed to be a section cut view. So I would have to display the view and then manually come over here and turn on my clipping plane in order for me to see everything. All right, so again, I have to manually do all this. I do not have to do this if I've set the display of my capture up correctly, then it will automatically do this for me. So again, if I display the view versus displaying the capture, right, I get a little bit more controllability and it goes directly to the information that I needed. Here with the notes, I'm only going to show you guys a couple more examples. If I display the notes, again, it's only concerned about the annotation. So you can see how it's like zoomed in a little bit too far. So like the notes is almost being blocked by my tree. So I would like to control that with a camera viewpoint that's a little bit further zoomed out. So I did that with my capture. I made a camera viewpoint. So now when I display my capture, I don't have to fool with hiding and showing the tree in order to see my entire notes. And then the last one here I'll do here is just the section view. So once again, if I display the view, right, it adjusts the camera so that way it's seeing all of the annotation. And then I would have to manually come over here and click on the clipping plane icon. And then in this case, you can see it's cutting off like the left side of the model, where if I display the capture, right, it'll kind of have all that stuff embedded in one. So when you guys are dealing with exclusively, right, a digital process where you don't have that 2D drawing, the captures is really going to make it a lot easier. Now, to set up the actual captures themselves, it doesn't take a whole lot of time, and it's really beneficial for like everyone in the long term. So I am going to step you through kind of how to do this now. And I'm going to use the same part file. I'm just going to use one that doesn't have as many of the captures and stuff created. So let me close this one down, and we'll go through the one where we're going to create the captures. So again, very similar setup, same parts. And I've done a little bit of the prep work already. So again, I'm assuming in this webinar that you guys know how to create some of those different views. So I've created a front view, a section view, and a top view, and then inside of those I've placed a couple of annotation data inside of it. So the first thing that we're going to do is to manually create a capture for the front view. And what I first want to point out is the proper way, or the way that requires you to not have to edit as much later on. The proper way is just to be cognizant of your double clicking. So if you're in CATIA at all, you know that double clicking can sometimes change things and can sometimes break things. So I want to point out that we're dealing with an active view when we create things in the 3D FT&A workbench, and the active view is just changed with a double click. So if I double click here, I've now changed. If I double click here, I've now changed the active view. And the active view is going to be highlighted in the blue box, and it's also, the icon's going to have like that brighter orange. So again, the kind of proper way of doing things, so that way you don't have to modify things later on, is to first have the view that you want the capture created for, have that to be active. And then the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to assign a camera viewpoint. So the easiest way to assign a camera viewpoint is if you are going to tell there's a button down here in your view toolbar called normal view. So normal meaning right straight in the camera up, so that way it's perpendicular to that view plane. So if you click on that, it will readjust the camera. So that way, yes, this is kind of how I want the camera to be when I create that capture. Now, what you're going to do is at this point just customize how much you want to zoom in, and do you want to make it like left of center or right of center? That's completely up to you. So I'm going to try and put this right in the middle of my screen, and I'll zoom in enough so that way, right, my top and bottom dimensions are pretty close to the boundaries of my screen. The next thing that I'm going to do is create that saved camera viewpoint, and to create these custom camera viewpoints, you're going to use the flyout here for the quick views, and it's the last one at the bottom called named views. When you click on it, you're going to come up here and hit add, and please don't be that person that just leaves the default naming convention, because you're going to get confused over, oh, what was camera 3 again? So meaningful descriptive names help you a lot here. So this camera that I'm creating, this camera viewpoint, is to be associated with the front view. So I'm going to call this my front view camera. And then I'll hit apply and then click OK. And next, we're going to establish the actual capture. To do this, you're going to make sure that you're in the 3D FT&A workbench, and you're going to go up to Insert, and then right here, Capture and Capture. And then if you want, you can add the icon somewhere on your screen or make a keyboard shortcut for it. But I'm going to click on Capture, and because I had everything properly set up, so I had the view active that I wanted, it will kind of do some naming for me already. So it knows that the capture's name should be tied to whatever is the active view. And then right here for the viewpoint, you do have to manually change this. So the viewpoint, otherwise it'll go to automatic, which again, the camera is just going to adjust so that way it only shows you the annotations. So I'm going to switch this over to my front view camera and then click OK. And then here's the thing that you have to note. You just created the capture. So if I hit the plus sign, right, I do have this front view capture, but you created it, but you haven't really modified it at all. So the way that you kind of go into the area in which you modify or customize the capture is you double click on it. So yes, now I am actually telling you to physically double click. If I double click on the front view capture, it takes you, so don't freak out, because it does look like it took you into a slightly different workbench, because notice a lot of my buttons around the border of my screen has left. But this is the area, it's almost like its own little pseudo workbench where you're going to create how you want that capture to appear. So in this particular capture, I want the dimensions, these 3 dimensions only to be displayed. And the problem is that if you look at the screen, I got a lot of little black lines randomly showing up. Well, they're actually not random. Those black lines are remnants of the dimensions and the other annotation that are in the other views right now. So if I rotate down a little bit, you can see again, those black lines are just the other annotation data that's there. Well, if I am displaying the front view capture, I want to create it in such a way that I don't see those little remnants anymore. So the easiest way of doing this is to come over here and use the filter command. We are going to tell the filter to filter out any of those unwanted annotation options. So when you click on the filter command, and there's a lot of options that you have here. You can say filter, show me everything, none. You can do it by types if I only wanted to see dimensions or datums. But what I've found to be the easiest is that majority of the time, if you're making a front view capture, you want all of the dimensions associated with the front view to be in that capture. And you can do that really easily with a right click. So if I right click on the front view and I see this annotation and I hit select all, what that does is that any of the annotation data that's associated with that active, right, that front view, it highlights. And so now if I hit apply, you can see that it says number of selected items is 3. So now CATIA knows that in this capture, only grab those 3 specific dimensions. And then when I click OK, notice that those little black lines, those black remnants are not here on the screen anymore. So I have successfully set up my front view capture, right? I spun my camera around to a certain point and I cleaned up the screen. When you're done kind of setting up your capture, this is where you're going to hit the exit button, which is very similar to, exiting a sketch or workbench, or if you guys have created scenes in a product file, it's kind of the same deal. You're going to hit exit, and now you're back to the full-blown 3D FT&A workbench. Well, the problem with that is that now that I'm back to the full-blown 3D FT&A workbench, if I rotate my screen around, I realize that there were some dimensions and annotations of the section view and the top view, but I don't see them anymore. And the reason for that is when you have applied a capture and then you exit the capture, that capture and the way that you set up is what CATIA is currently using. So because there is this sense of like sometimes you want to go back to seeing everything or you want to restore the default, we typically recommend to create a default capture so that way you can quickly go back to it. Now, I'm going to create that in just a second, but because I don't have it created just yet, then the way that I'm going to come back and restore everything is by hitting the filter command, and then I would just tell it to filter all annotation data back on the screen. So it would return the 13 other entities that were within the section view and the top view. So once I hit apply, now you can see a bunch of that data is now back on the screen. So let's create that default view. And again, you can label it whatever you want. Default, I've heard it called ISO or a front quarter view. It's just the view that says restore all of my annotation data so that way I can see it. Typically, this is also associated with like an isometric view so that way you can see the model as a whole. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is just to kind of rotate my screen so that way it's a good viewpoint for me. So I'm going to come over here and maybe like say that this is a good viewpoint. So the first thing that I'll do is save this camera viewpoint here. Actually, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit because I know I'm going to have some other stuff later popping up on the screen to the side. So I click on my name views. Again, it's in that quick views file at the very bottom. I'll click on my name views and I'm going to hit add. And I'm going to call this my default view or default camera. Again, default ISO, whatever you want to call it. And then I'll click OK. And the camera is established, but we want to then create a view to be associated with that, and then we'll create the capture. So to create a view, and I'm not going to add any dimensions to this view, so it really doesn't, like I don't have to be really specific like what type of view that I'm using. I'm going to use the view from reference, and then I'll just choose, let's say, this top surface here. I will call this my default view, and then click OK. So now I have a default view, I have a default camera, and then we're going to finally go in there and create that default capture. So I'll go up to Insert, Capture, Capture. And again, because I have this activated, it carries that same name across. So the capture name will be the same. It'll be associated to that default view, and then I'm going to have it to use the default capture. So I click OK, and let's just make sure that everything works. So I'm going to right-click and display the capture of the front view. again, swings around, shows me only those 3 dimensions. And then if I want to get back to seeing everything on the screen, I right-click and hit Display Capture of the default view. So again, default view says take me back to just like a general isometric viewpoint of the camera and show me all of the dimensions for the entire annotation set. So we've got our front view, we've got our default view. Let's go ahead and create a section view. Now the section view is going to be tied to this section view right here. And by the way, when I click on the section view, and I'm not activating it, I'm just singularly clicking it, you can see that it shows you the location and it kind of cuts through that. It's going to show you that with like cutting through it because I have my 3D annotation query set to on. So like as you click on different things, it'll kind of automatically do that. This is a personal preference. If you do not want that to be the case, you can turn that off. So like now once I click on it, it just highlights the view frame, but it doesn't actually cut through the model. So with this section view, I'm going to actually show you what not to do, but how to fix it later. So I said, you know, traditionally what you do is you activate the view first, and then you make your camera viewpoint, and then you make your capture. So now, let's say I forget how to do all of that. So I'm on purpose going to be active at the wrong item. And I'm also not going to create a camera viewpoint. So if I were to simply come up here and say, let's just insert a capture, this should be my first clue. Pardon me, I got to click off in space, make sure it's not highlighted. So if I do my insert capture, right, this should be my first clue because this is saying default view instead of section view. But just in case, let's say I set it to be section view, I leave it set to the default view, not section view, and then my viewpoint I have set as automatic. So again, I don't do anything correctly. I don't have anything pre-highlighted. I don't have the view automatically kind of created beforehand. So if I double click now into my section view, which I know should be cutting like right through the middle of the part, once I double click to go in there and modify that capture, as soon as I see the camera swing around and I'm like, oh wait, that was not the right viewpoint, that should be your indication that you just have to go in there and readjust your inputs. So I'm going to exit out here, and the first thing that we're going to do is set up our camera viewpoint, and then I'll show you how to change these inputs around. So if I click on my section view and then just readjust so that way it's normal to it, I'm going to then save that named view or that custom camera viewpoint. So I'm going to click on it, and then I'll hit add, and I'll call this my section view camera. And I'll hit apply and click OK. And then if I right click here on where it says section view, there's an option that's called change capture support. So this is where you can now say, well, I want the section view to be associated with the actual section view itself, and then the viewpoint that I want it to use is the section view camera. So I click OK. So now everything is referenced appropriately. And if I double click to go inside of my section view, it's a section view, so it's supposed to cut through the model. So what would I want button to turn it on? I want to turn on this clipping plane. Now you can see that the clipping plane, which is, again, we're in that like pseudo different workbench where we establish the captures. It's actually here at the top on my screen. You guys know the deal, CATIA buttons can be anywhere, but you're just going to find the clipping plane. So immediately, every time I go into the section view capture, it'll automatically know to tell the camera to go to this location, also cut through the middle of the model. But let's say that I want to get a little bit fancier. You can see that it's cutting through the model, and it's just displaying it as like the default gray cross-section because that's what my part model is. So let's have CATIA to show us the actual like hatching lines. You can also do dots or an image. Now, in order for this to work properly, your first internal option that you might want to remember is this one. It's under Tools and Options. On the left-hand side, you are going to have to go over to your Functional Tolerance and Annotation, which is under Mechanical Design. And then it's under the Display tab, which is the second tab if you go all the way back to the beginning. It's a little bit further down, but there's this option here that says display the actual hatching, coloring, or dotting for the clipping plane, which is what we have. So it's supposed to display it, right, the hatching, the dotting, or the coloring, but it's not really doing that here. So what you have to remember is that it's a kind of a two-step process. You have to have the option turned on, but it also has to have a material applied to it. So because this doesn't have a material applied to it, that's why we're not seeing any of the specialty coloring or the hatching. So I am going to exit out of my capture, and then I'm going to switch over to the part design workbench just long enough for us to apply material. And in this case, I'm going to apply material, aluminum, to my solid model. So there it is, there's aluminum. And after I've applied the material, I'll switch back to my functional tolerancing and annotation. And then we'll double click to go back in here to the section view. So immediately you can see that, you know, obviously because I have my clipping plane button turned on, how it does now display. It's a green kind of section cut color, and then I also have the two parallel lines here, and that hatching will be associated with whatever material that you applied. So these two parallel lines, that pattern is specific to the aluminum. However, there's two options that you can change here for this. So the first one is the actual color that CATIA uses by default. So I've had a couple people in the past who have really had a hard time seeing like a red-green or blue-green or red-green color blindness. So if you need to customize, just like customizing the background, I like this lighter blue. I have a really bad eyesight, so I need that juxtaposition. So you can do that here. I'll show you where this is at right now. If you go into Tools and Options, and then this time you're actually going to go over to the Display tab and then over to the Visualization tab. This low intensity elements, that's actually what you're seeing as the default color that CATIA uses when it cuts through something that's solid here in these FT&A section cuts. So instead, maybe I would want to choose like a darker color. So maybe I'll use this darker purple and then click OK. So immediately you can see how that color is adjusted, and because it turned to such a dark color, I can't see the black parallel hatching lines very clearly anymore. So now the second option is that you can also change the physical pattern. You can have it to be hatching lines, dots. You can also physically just like import an image, which is kind of cool. And you're going to do all of that actually inside of the material itself. So I got to find the material in my tree, right-click and go to Properties. I'm going to come over to the Drawing tab, which is down here at the very bottom, or at the very end, I should say. And let's just kind of go through some of these options. So first off, if I wanted to have some dots, and I'm going to have these to be green dots, and then click Apply and click OK. It's kind of the annoying part. It won't show it to you. You have to reapply or redisplay the capture. So now you can see I've got those little green dots on that darker background. You can change the size so that way there's more dots that appear. I'm back to right-click and Properties on the material, and the next option would be to actually insert an image. I don't have an image. I just don't have pictures on my work computer, so let me just make one really quickly. So I'm going to click on the snipping tool, and I am just going to snip, and I'm just going to snip the little view toolbar down at the bottom, and I will save that as a JPEG, and I'll just save it here on my desktop. And so now if I hit Browse and go grab that and then open it up and then apply it, which I have to kind of re-display the capture, I just want to point out that this is, I think, really quite awesome of CATIA. It takes that image, and then if it needs to, it kind of duplicates it. So now I'm seeing that image across all of the area of actual section cutting through that model. And then the last thing, I'm going to right-click and go to Properties one more time, and that's the hatching, which is what we started off with. So this hatching aluminum has two parallel lines, which is why I have a hatching 1 and 2 tab. So I'm going to have these lines to be green, and then they're going to be dashed and slightly thicker. And then the same thing for the first hatch line, I'll have it to be green, a dashed line, and slightly thicker. And then maybe I'll actually have this to go in a -45, so they'll actually intersect with each other. Again, I'll hit Apply and click OK, and now you can see that I've got this picture associated with any time that I cross through solid material and I want CATIA to use the clipping plane capability of my capture. So I'll exit out, and that is kind of combining a section cut plus a camera viewpoint for a capture. And then while we're here, let's talk about the importance of this little red dot. This little red dot is called our current state. So when you are creating these different captures, the red dot kind of follows which one that you go to. So like if I display the default view, notice that that red dot has switched, and then it also activates the default view down here. If I display the front view, notice the red dot changes, and then the front view is also what is highlighted or active down at the bottom. So let me switch back to the section view. What this means is that if I were to add a dimension right now, a new dimension, then that new dimension is automatically associated with the section view because that's what's active. But it's also, by default, going to be placed inside of just the section view because that's the one that is current. So to show you an example of this, I'm going to place a diameter dimension on this kind of inside cutout right here. So I will create it, and then I'm going to drag it up a little bit. It's yelling at me because I didn't click and drag on the right spot. So I'll drag it up and kind of place it here. So now let's test this to see exactly what it did. The 15 diameter dimension is only going to be visualized inside of the section cut because that was the current state. So what happens is if I go to the default view and display it, notice that my 15 my diameter size isn't there at all. Like I can't physically see it. So what you need to do is at some point you would have to perhaps move a dimension from one capture to another, or to simply add it. So I always want to make sure that my dimensions that I create are in the default view. And there's two ways that you can do this. And I'll show you the first way now, and then I'll show you the second way a little bit. But the first way is to come back into the section, find the dimension value, right-click on it, and come down to this capture management. So it is only displayed in the section view. If I want it to also display in the default view, I grab it and I send it over to the right. So let's test it, make sure that it works. I right-click on the default view and hit Display Capture, and wouldn't you know it, the 15 diameter value still shows up here on this screen. So you can change any dimensions that you want to kind of have displayed from capture to capture using the right-click capture management. And if for any reason you would want to not have a dimension to physically show up inside of the capture that you're currently active on or the current state, you can go in there and manually turn that off. If you right-click and then just hit Unset Current, you can see how the little red dot disappears. And that now means that like any dimension or annotation that I would add at this point right now would not actually show up in the default view capture unless I went through and manually added it. But by default, when you right-click and hit Display, it'll automatically become the current state, and then it will switch that view to also be active as well. All right, we're going to do two more kind of views and captures here to finish up the webinar. So the next one that we're going to do is to talk about creating a detailed view for this hole that I have. So I've got a counter drilled hole over here that I want to be able to create a specific view. So to go back to my default view, we'll just simply reestablish being able to see everything on the screen. And then in my geometrical set, I've already created a plane. I'm going to show you guys this really quickly. That plane is cutting through the model in a perpendicular fashion. So that's the plane that I'm going to end up using to show all of this information on. So let me hide that plane just to declutter the screen. And next, we're going to create the view first. And I'm going to create that view here with the button View from Reference. I'll select on the plane because anytime you create a view, you have to click on a planar face. And then here's the takeaway from these options, the projection section and section cut. These are going to play importance in their differences if you're actually using like a separate drawing file for it. So projection view is not going to cut through anything. Section view is going to cut through things, and it's going to show the information in the background, whereas a section cut is going to cut through it but not show any of the background information. If you know you're eventually going to be using these for a separate drawing, then you would want to make sure to set these up properly. But for right now, I just want to show you that the differences for, in my case, if I know that I'm not going to be generating a separate 2D drawing and I'm using only the 3D data, The difference here between these two is that the projection view does not automatically create a capture, whereas the section view does. So just to show you quickly, if I make it a projection view and call this whole detail view, and then just to make it more clear, I'll put in parentheses that this is the projection option, and I click OK, notice the view is created, but no capture is created. So let me delete that out and show you if I choose the same button, view from reference, I choose my same reference plane. But now if I choose the type, the section cut, or the section view, excuse me, and same thing, I'm going to call this my whole detail view, but this one is the section. As soon as I click OK, notice what happens. It not only created the view, but it also created the capture for me. So it made it associated with that view, but it didn't change the camera viewpoint. And we'll make the camera viewpoint in just a second and then switch that around. So inside of this whole detail view, I'm not going to do anything super crazy. I just want to call out the dimensions of this whole. So I'm going to do that here with a text with a leader line. So I'll click over here. And I know some information about the hole, so I'm just going to type that. I know I have 4 holes, so I'm going to say I have 4 of them. And then up to the top, I can use my little specialty symbol drop down to kind of add a couple of the symbols. At the top, the general hole is going to have a diameter of 4.918. It does have a counterbore, and that counterbore diameter size, again, adding new symbols, is a radius of 8, and the counterbore depth is a depth of 2. So I've created this, and I can kind of grab this and move it around if I need to. And then the last thing that I want to do is just add the angle here for this chamfer. So I'll do that with my button here. All right, so I've got my 2 dimensions, and what I would like to do is create a camera viewpoint for that, so that way I can tell that particular camera viewpoint to be associated with that capture. So the first thing I'll do is just straighten my camera back up. So I'll click on the view and hit my normal 2. And then readjust the camera. So maybe I want it to look, I don't know, something like this. I'm going to click on my name views, hit add, same as before, whole detail view camera. Apply and OK. And now we're going to tell the capture to use that camera. You right click on it and you say change capture support, and you just choose that new camera location. Double click to then allow yourself to kind of figure out how you want it to be either filtered, or do you want the clipping plane to always be automatically assumed on. So because this is obviously cutting through the middle of my hole, I do want my clipping plane turned on, and therefore it's going to hatch because I have a material applied. I also want to make sure that I'm seeing just these 2 dimensions, so I'll click on my filter, and you can either right click here and say show me only those selected annotations, or you can also just hold them down with the control key. So notice that it's going to only ever show me those 2. I click OK. I exit out of my capture, and let's just make sure, run through these again, make sure everything works properly. So the front view, I display it. Default view, I display it. Section view, display that capture. And then finally, with our whole detail view, we would display that capture. So the problem is that if I go back to the default view, that 110 angle and then that hole size is not included here. So remember, you can either right-click and you can say go to the capture management, but the other thing that you can do is you can just double-click to go back into that default view, hit your filter, and then tell CATIA to just show all. And now as soon as I did that, you can see that I have my 2 dimensions added back. And then I would exit my capture. So again, you can do it manual with right-clicking on each newly created dimension and hitting capture management, or you can go in there and just double-click back on the capture. All right, our last thing to go through here is to create a surface roughness view. So that's going to be going right down the middle of the part. So it's going to be on my ZX plane. So once again, I'll click on my view from reference. I'll go grab my ZX plane. It's towards the top. And then once again, you've got your 2 choices here, or 3 choices when it comes to the type, your projection, section, or section cut. Again, the difference would be in the drawing for these, if you know you're going to be eventually creating the drawing. But for me, I know I'm only using the 3D part file to display this information. So the difference now is like one creates the capture and then this one does not. So I'll do a projection view here. and I'll call this my surface roughness, and then click OK. So I've created that view, and in that view, I'm going to grab my surface roughness symbol, and I know that I need some certain kind of surface precision to be in like the centered two holes. So I'm going to click right here, and I know that I need to have it an RZ of 32 microns, and a material removal is prohibited. So when I click OK, and I'm just going to drag this out just a tiny bit here, when I click on the actual annotation, it will highlight the surface that's associated with it. But I also need that RZ max value down here at the bottom as well. Now, I could just make a separate symbol, but I can also, there's two different methods. I can somehow tell CATIA to physically display that is to take place in two other locations. So the first way that you can do this, excuse me, is to right-click on the annotation, come down to the associated geometry, and click on Geometry Connection Management. So it's physically listing the fact that that surface roughness symbol is tied to this surface. And so what you can do is you can right-click here and you can say, well, I just want to add another surface. So when you right-click and add, I would click on the inside of that smaller hole. And then when I click OK, now if I were to select in my annotation, both of them highlight. And again, the reason why both of them are highlighting is because of my 3D annotation query switch set to be on. If I turn this off, right, it's not going to highlight anything. So again, it's one of those buttons that people kind of turn off and on. But that's one method. But let's say that you want to make this thing even more evident, that like these two surfaces should be, right, the same surface roughness. What you're going to do is utilize some extracted surfaces. So we are going to have the surfaces to only show up in this one particular capture. So there's another option that you are going to have to go into your internal settings and find, and the option is over here. So we're going to go over to our mechanical design. Let me scroll down and find functional tolerance and annotation. Scroll over, and it's over this view annotation plane right here. So manage the visibility of part instances, bodies, and geometrical sets. So because I already have mine turned on, then this capability is now kind of being recorded. So for certain captures, if I'm inside of the capture and I tell something to be visualized or not, it knows to only display it inside of that one capture. Now you can also do this on an individual basis. If you right-click on any previously created captures, you can also kind of turn on or off this button that way as well. So I have my surface roughness view created. Now let's come in here and create our extractions. To start off, I'm going to have to switch over to the Generative Shape Design Workbench. So when I switch over to the Generative Shape Design Workbench, I'm going to insert a new geometrical set just to kind of keep things organized. It doesn't really matter here, the name, so I'll leave the default name as geometrical set 2. I'm going to use the extract command, and I want to extract those surfaces. Therefore, I am using a tangent continuity which wraps around kind of the first thing that I click on. As long as it's nice and smooth, it'll grab it. And then I also want to grab the inside of this hole. So with the extract command, you do have to grab the little grab bag here in order to have multiple inputs. So I will click OK. I have these two extracted surfaces. And just to make it even more clear, I'm going to tell that entire geometrical set with the help of my graphic properties toolbar to just show up as yellow. So, right, yellow is getting someone's attention. So now that I have that created, I'm going to switch back to my functional tolerancing and annotation workbench, and we are going to make one extra note, and that note is going to be created here as just a free-floating text, and I'll put it just directly above it, and it is going to say that all yellow surfaces. And then if you hit enter, it actually closes the box on you. So if you're ever wanting to make multiple lines of text, to hit shift enter, have same roughness. All right, and then I'll just kind of scoot this up here. So we just got to create this one last capture, but before we create the capture, we have to create the camera viewpoint. So I will straighten my camera with the help of the normal view up. And then I'll take the time to just kind of figure out where I want it. I'll click on named view. I will hit add. This will be our roughness camera. And I'll hit apply and click OK. And now let's create finally that capture. So insert capture captures. I will then have that surface roughness camera to be utilized. Double click to go into that. And then finally, I do want to show the internal, so that way I can see the highlight surfaces. So I want to make sure that clipping plane is activated here. And I want to make sure that nothing else were to show up. So I'll grab my filter, and again, you can either hold down the control key or you can right click and say to select all the annotations. So that way CATIA knows to grab just those 2 items. Then I'll exit out, and let's just make sure that everything's working. So my surface roughness is the capture that's currently being displayed. If I were to go to, let's say, a front view, right click and hit display of that, you can see that the yellow surfaces are not visualized here. If I were to go to the whole detail view, right click and hit display capture, right, once again, the yellow surfaces are not displayed here. So it knows to only display that in that capture, because only in that capture is what I had when I had it visualized. And again, all of those options are kind of buried within your internal FT&A. And the 3 important ones here are going to be, let me just review those here quickly. If you go over to display visualization, if you want to change that low intensity element, and then the other 2 are going to be in the FT&A options. You're going to have, slide over here, under the view and annotation plane, you have that manage the visibility of parts, and then over to the display tab, you have below, you have the hatching display as well. So those are the 3 options here that you just want to make sure that you know where they're at. All right, really quickly, I just want to show you the principal views, and I'm going to open up this product file. Now, products have their own workbench. It's the product FT&A, but the buttons are similar. And I want to show you something special that was kind of recently added into like the later versions of CATIA. It's called printable views. So when you click on a printable view, just as like the standard view from reference, you still have to click on a flat surface. But what happens is there's a bounding box that gets created all around this part file. And that bounding box is now going to be the actual faces of any of these additional views that you want to create. So as I click on them, it'll actually show you like this is where the left view would be, the right view, top, bottom, and then the rear. And then as soon as you click OK for CATIA to create that, I want to show you that not only did it create all 6 of those views, it also went ahead and created all of those captures as well. So if I double click to go back to active on the front view and were to add something in here quickly like a dimension, then that dimension is of course tied to that view, but it automatically becomes created in that capture as well because of our little red dot, our current state. The only difference is if I were to quickly come in here and display the capture, notice that it zoomed in towards the top because that is like what it's programmed to do. The automatic camera viewpoint says only focus on the actual annotations. So if I were to want to show like the entire spark plug, I would have to go back in there and create my own custom camera viewpoint. And just like before, come down here and right click and say change the support, and then just switch this around to your own camera viewpoint. Sorry, I went a little long-winded. This is what I was wanting to show you guys here for this webinar is really just how to utilize the capture camera viewpoint, how to create a default one, and then some of those internal options that you would want to make sure that you have turned on in order for you to see things.